This is our second lecture on our unit on Islam, Byzantium, and Japan. So today we're going to be talking about feudal Japan from about the year 400 to 1300 AD. Japan itself is made up of over 4,000 islands that make up the Japanese archipelago. And archipelago is a long string of islands. This will make more sense when we see it on the map. If you remember your plate tectonics from your biology or say like a world geography class, you know that the plates on the Earth are constantly shifting, where the Asian plate and the Pacific plate are running into each other. We see a lot of volcanic activity, and this is causing lots of volcanoes, which bubble up and form the long island chain that makes up of this giant archipelago stretching from nearly Alaska in the north down to China in the South Pacific as we move into south and west. However, even though there's 4,000 of these different islands, they're ranging from pretty substantial ones to tiny just bits of rock in the middle of the Pacific, most people in Japan today have lived and live on the four largest islands of the archipelago. Like we said, the geography of it being very volcanic, there's lots of mountains on these Japanese islands, storms from the blowing off the Pacific, as well as earthquakes are a constant theme throughout Japanese history, even up into the present day. As the Japanese people began to kind of coalesce and assemble on the islands, we begin to see in early Japanese history hundreds of different clans working to control their own territory, not only on their own islands, but across multiple islands if they could. And again, lots of them different, kind of clawing themselves out in its early history. In this early part of Japanese history, the religion that kind of developed locally on the island is one of, like we see in Mesopotamia or in other polytheistic religions, of thousands of local nature gods and goddesses that eventually over time will form what's called the Shinto religion. So this is very much a religion that's tied up in oneness with nature and the what we see in nature. As a part of the religion, we have what are called kami. These are divine spirits in nature, and these will kind of manifest themselves in different ways. If you see kind of like a knot in a tree that kind of looks like a face, or a root that looks like an arm, those can be considered like kamis that again are going to intervene to help and or hinder you throughout your life as you're trying to kind of work your way into the nature around there. By the time we get to the 7th century AD, we see that a emperor is ruling Japan, most notably as a figurehead with another power behind the throne. The Japanese believe that they're descendants of the Yamato people, the first emperor descended from the heavens himself. And so this emperor is not just a political figure, but he also has a religious, almost godlike aspect to him that really is going to remain with the kind of figure of the emperor in Japan up into really the 20th century through World War II. So you have to kind of understand that the emperor in Japan, it's not so much as a theocracy as we talked about with, say, ancient Egypt and the pharaohs, but there's a religious aspect to the political leadership in Japan with the emperor. So here's most modern day Japan. I guess is the major islands. If you go to the north, I'll get my laser pointer. If you go to the north and you keep going all the way up to Alaska, and then it goes all the way down, a bunch of different island chains that we see. Again, Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, Kyushu are the four major ones where most people live today. Today, Japan politically is broken up to what are called different prefectures. So we have the four major islands, and it's kind of subdivided up. States is a wrong way to say it, like the United States, but subdivided up into the different ones with the four major islands, and then Okinawa is also considered part of mainland Japan as well. The Shinto religion, again, we can dive into nuts and bolts of it, but nature gods and goddesses coming out from nature to go out, and again, very polytheistic in terms of trying to compare it to some of the other major religions we've talked about, not only in this unit, but in previous parts of this year so far. Japanese culture begins to have increased contact with the Asian mainland by the 400s. So we see humans have moved out of Africa, across Asia, and have gotten themselves into the Japanese archipelago as we move into the Common Era. And by around the 400s, we're starting to see the people who have settled on modern day Japan having more contact with the Asian mainland. This is not just from the Japanese people themselves, but also people coming from the Korean Peninsula. And the Koreans are going to be the ones that are having the major impact. It's a pretty short boat ride from the Korean Peninsula to Japan, not only today, but throughout history. And the Korean travelers are going to bring Buddhism from Asia to Japan by the mid 700s. And what we'll see here is this will mix and evolve with the Shinto religion to develop a Japanese style of Buddhism called Zen Buddhism, which has Buddhist aspects of it mixed up with that Shinto religion that we talked about in the previous slide. We also see that the Japanese are going to copy and adapt many of the Chinese ways. We kind of, again, think very much in the United States in our Western civilization kind of mindset, but China very much looms large over not only just Asian history, but world history for a very long time. And so the Chinese civilization is this big, giant behemoth to the west of Japan. And so it makes sense that they're going to culturally influence Japanese development as way as the Japanese are going to see how China has been doing, and again, has been cooking along for a couple thousand years at this point, and they're going to evolve and adapt many of the things that China has. The biggest one, and obviously that's highlighted there for you, is the Japanese are, again, we want to say copy in the loosest sense, but adapting the Chinese system of writing. If I go and put in front of a room of my high school freshmen, Japanese writing on one side of the board and Chinese writing on the other, they're not going to be able to tell it apart. So the Chinese system of writing has a huge impact on Japanese development, but as well as painting, everyday living, and the government system that we see. So by the time we get to about what's called the high-end period in Japanese history, this lasts from about 794 to 1185. And what marks this period of Chinese history different from previous periods is a very refined court society. The in and around Osaka and the and Kyoto in Japan, where the emperor is going and living, we very much see the upper class developing their own culture separate from what the farming and agricultural communities throughout the rest of the islands have. So very much the power of Japan becomes centralized in and around this area in the capital of High-End. And what marks this period of Japanese history from others is the very elaborate ceremonies that come out of this. Still around today, that dates back to this time period is the Japanese tea ceremony, where again you're almost using this not just to enjoy a cup of tea, but to kind of almost center yourself, block all distractions, and go and do this. And this Japanese tea ceremony evolves to be very elaborate, where you have to put on your special tea ceremony kimono. You have to tie the belt not just a certain way. You have to go and you have to get the correct way of getting the water, and you have to pour it out of the teapot just so, and you're putting so many leaves, and the spoon was there. So we're again, that's just one example of this. And the high-end period also marks a high point of arts and literature for kind of this general area of Japanese history. Out of this comes the first novel, and really you almost can think of it from a world history's perspective, the first kind of true novel in the tale of Genji. Very much a tale of princes and princesses and princesses and court intrigue and I love you, but I'm not love this, so that type of stuff. And we see that developed in this time period here in Japan. Now, this is great if you're in high end. This is great if you're part of this inner circle and you have all this free time to be able to do your tea ceremony and to study art and to read these books. But if you're outside of the capital, you really don't have a whole lot of ability to get there. Remember, this is your fastest way is by boat. You're going to travel across islands if you have. So a lot of the large landowners who feel that they're just as powerful and just as wealthy as the people in and around the capital begin to get more and more jealous because again, they've got FOMO, they've got this fear of missing out of the new stuff, the new chapter, the new this, the new art, the new movement. So they begin to grow more and more jealous of the power centered in and around the capital, and they begin to want more power from themselves. If you're not going to include us in your ceremonies, then maybe we want to go and do our other stuff. So, like we said, the Chinese are going to have a huge influence on Japan. So, we have some early Japanese writing that obviously heavily influenced in style and form and function by Chinese. Obviously, modern day Chinese writing and modern day Japanese writing is very different, but it gets its start from taking Chinese and adapting it to the Japanese use. This is an example not only just a painting, but this is a scene from the tale of Genji. And so we see not only the arts that are being inspired by this book, but um, the words on the page that as well that are coming out of this. And again, this is a short little snippet of these two ladies getting ready to sit down for their tea ceremony, getting all the different stuff all out ready to go. And again, this all takes time. And who's going to have time? Well, it's not going to be the farmers who have to etch out a living in the dirt, in the ground, who are constantly having to farm and keep their animals going to feed themselves. This is going to be people at the court who can pay for servants, who can pay for all this stuff, who are able to sit down and do all this stuff. So that's setting their culture and their life on a different path than from other people as well as other large landowners. So what we see here as the high end period comes to a close is that the court in and around the emperor begins to focus just in and around the emperor and the court. The emperor becomes less and less concerned with controlling the outer territories. Just think it always has been this way. We're going to do that. And so what we see is that with the lack of imperial control, lawlessness starts to reign in the countryside with pirates, with bandits, with brigands, causing all sorts of problems. Not so much a issue for the people in high end, but for the large landowners who have been relying on imperial protection, they're the ones who are now suffering from that. So those large landowners who are already jealous of missing out on all the arts and the literature and high end begin to create their own private armies with the rationale being if the emperor is not going to protect us, well, then we're going to have to rely on ourselves. So they begin to create these large armies to go and protect their land holdings. And as they have their private armies, the brigands, the pirates, the bandits, then move on to the smaller landowners. The smaller landowners might not be able to afford these armies for protection, so they begin to make a trade. They begin to trade their land to the larger landowners in exchange for getting protection from those large landowners' properties. So the exchange then begins to happen between the small landowners get protection, and in return, they give up their land to these larger landowners. As those larger landowners begin to expand, remember, Japan is a bunch of islands. So there is only so much area you can expand to. You can't just create more land. You can't just keep going west. You can't keep going east. You can't keep going west. You're contained. So as those large landowners begin to expand, absorbing more of the small landowners, that brings them into conflict with other large landowners. What's the effect of this? Is that wars between these rival lords and these rival large landowners start to become more and more commonplace. How are they able to have their own have these wars? Because they have their own private armies. So these armies begin warring each other. What's the emperor doing? Still focused on ruling in high end and his court. So these wars become more commonplace. Those lords not only want to protect their economic and political interests, they want to protect themselves. So these lords, because of all this war happening, begin to surround themselves with a group of loyal bodyguards. These loyal bodyguards are called samurai, and they begin to be trained in explicit military training from a very young age in order to be able to grow up to protect these lords. And then over time, we see a shift from just being quote unquote bodyguards to being an elite warrior class. And so these are, again, people who from a young age begin to devote all their time to just becoming a warrior. So they don't have to worry about farming to do that. They're just going and studying and becoming excellent in the art of war. And so because of this, they become very powerful. If someone has a sword and you don't, that gives them an advantage. If you spend all your time farming and another person spends all their time training to fight, you're at a disadvantage there. So the samurai begin to realize this and develop a demanding code of behavior for their class called Bushido. And this code of behavior is to help regulate this warrior class. We'll do a homework assignment on this to better explain a little bit more of the ins and outs of this. But basically, it's to make sure that the samurai are using their military prowess against other equally military people or in battle rather than becoming big bullies and rampaging through the countryside. The and this very strict code of behavior, punishments for most of these infractions is death, all right, or you have to commit ritual suicide for going against this code. And this is something that's ingrained in you as a samurai from the moment you start your training to you take your last breath when you leave the earth. So a very demanding code. You can read all about this in various different books that survive today that kind of go and regulate how you're supposed to act as a samurai in the world. Towards the end of the high end period, the emperors begin to realize that they have no control over their nominal country. And so they begin to want to be able to regain that control that the large landowners have gotten in their own areas um, through the use of the military. So the emperor is going to create the title of shogun, and this is the supreme general of the emperor's army, who basically goes and does all the fighting in the name of the emperor. What we see over time, though, and we're going to skip a whole bunch of Japanese history, we'll pick this up in second semester, is that from the 1200s to the 1868, really the political power of Japan is controlled by these different shoguns. And you can divide up Japanese history in this time period into what are called different shogunates, where the different shogun are in charge. And really the emperor is doing his own thing in his own way, being almost, again, that godlike, untouchable figure who really isn't doing a whole lot day to day, politically, economically, military in Japan. It's really the shogun that goes and runs the show. And we'll see how this plays out when we get to second semester of why 1868 is a pretty hard cutoff when we see who shows up in Nagasaki Bay demanding to be able to bring Japan from literally the year 1200 into the 19th century. So, we're just going to talk about samurai, and again, we could talk about samurai for all day. But again, what we want to understand is something that's is pretty interesting. And if you take a look from just a 35,000-foot global view of the of mankind's development here, and what we see is very interesting in that in separate places on the earth, we have absolutely no contact with each other. Medieval Europe and Imperial Japan, both of these societies at roughly the same time develop and again, this is kind of a naughty F word, feudalism, right, to be able to kind of explain the political and economic and social and military um, kind of order for both societies, and also a dominant warrior class with the kind of your stereotypical medieval knight in medieval Europe versus your Japanese samurai. So it's a very interesting phenomenon that both these places develop a similar way of governing, a similar way of running their society, a similar warrior class, roughly the same time of the earth with no contact. It's not like they're sharing notes and they're passing notes underneath the table about this. So something that's very interesting. And again, we could talk about samurai all day. The main weapon of the samurai, again, is the samurai sword, the katana. I usually have a longer sword and then a shorter one. And again, like we see in medieval Europe, these samurai swords are one going to be works of art. And we're talking about the creation of what the first time steel is created on the earth. It's the Japanese who are really creating steel for the first time in their samurai swords. Like we see with, say, King Arthur and his sword Excalibur and the mythology around that, different samurai swords would also be imbued with mythologies and gods and stuff right here. The picture on the left is showing the goddess who's being put into the sword by the swordsmith, and then the picture on the right is showing from one time in Japanese period 28 of the best swordsmiths in the country, that if you were a samurai, you would want to go to one of these guys to be able to go and make your sword for you. So again, a similar, what we want to, yeah, again, something that's pretty interesting is to be able to compare what a knight on the Second Crusade, here in this would be the early 1100s, would take with him on crusade versus what a Japanese samurai would take. Now, obviously, this is a picture taken in the 1860s, 1870s. But if we were to go back and forth, if you want to pause the video and go back and forth, you can see very similar, not only armor that's developed, but also accoutrement and weapons to be able to go and help a knight or a samurai on campaign and in battle. Like we see with medieval knights, the Japanese armor is going to develop in almost not only a functional form of protecting and providing movement on the battlefield, but also becomes an artistic form as well. So you can start to see not only the intricate detailing on these four examples of samurai suits of armor, but we get there in this idea of the helmets as well, where again you're trying to scare your opponent away before they even show up. And these become even larger and more elaborate over time to where we get almost the dragonfly there on the left and the lobster with mustache on the right. So this time period in Japanese history, and again, is going to be various shogunates fighting not only amongst themselves, amongst the large landowners, and we see the ebb and flow of imperial control across Japanese geography and across Japanese time as people are trying to go and fight and control for each other. So you can kind of see that on those four panels there, as well as again the Japanese going and fighting as they're doing that. And then again, as we saw, the code of Bushido helps to regulate all of the samurai so that they're only fighting against others. They're not picking on kids. They're not picking on women. They're using their skills in battle rather than to oppress other people. When we talk about the medieval code of conduct for your European knights and chivalry, it's a little bit of the same idea of why it needs to be developed and some of the ins and outs of its development. And again, the consequence of breaking that code is usually death by your own hand or a fellow samurai for dishonoring your fellow clan or your kind of class of warrior to be able to hold up yourself in society. And then we don't have a whole lot of time, but there's ninjas as well. So that's going to end our study of Japan.